Hey everyone, today we're doing a special AutoHotkey Hero session where we're doing like a mini webinar for Hero members. I'm going to stream this to YouTube later, but Hero members are the only ones that can attend and ask questions. So, and before we get started, just because here's the thing, like the Hero program, I think is an amazing value, and we have Hero members here. And I think a lot of the people that especially attend our YouTube sessions, the live sessions on Friday mornings, should be Hero members, right? Like they're prime fit for it. And it's not that I'm trying to make the money, it's that the value's there. And so if some of the heroes want to chime in about what do you like about the program? Is it worth the money you're spending?
Yeah, I mean, it's, there's very regular calls, there's a lot of experienced users. So, that's where the value is, right? It's, we get to pick Isaiah's brain and, ask questions in a group setting. I think it's great.
The other thing that it affords you is the ability to listen to approaches and topics and ways of doing things that you may not have thought of. And maybe it isn't going to be immediately useful to you, but maybe in a week or a month or whatever, you'll be in somewhere looking at something and you'll remember, oh yeah, this was discussed, or this command was discussed, or a different approach that may never have occurred to you. So you do get a lot of exposure, even if you're not actively doing something at the time.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how it's really important to listen to what other people are doing. And sometimes things jump in your head of like, oh my God, I never thought about doing that.
Yeah, right now the webinar today is especially about that. We're going to show 17 ways to automate programs. So probably few of them but maybe there are others that you don't know. And even if you don't learn them right now, it might come up handy at other points.
Cool. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Now I have a document here. So this is some of the first things you need to think about before you pick on the approach you're going to take. Right? It's just things that you need to, no matter what you're doing with AutoHotkey, anything you're automating, right? Is it, one, is the library I'm going to use an internal thing to AutoHotkey, or am I going to be relying on external libraries? Like for instance, the UI library, possibly, or doing something, and we're not covering, by the way, we have a whole different webinar, which I'll put the link up here, on 9 different ways to automate browsers, right? Because that is a whole different topic, but it's just a good example of with browser automation, there are several different approaches using different libraries, external libraries. Is it going to be something that could be run real? Are you going to be running your script on one computer, or is it going to be on multiple computers? If, sometimes if I'm just running stuff on my computer, I take a much simpler, quicker, dirtier approach than if it's something I'm going to share with other people. That's something critical. It's one of our first questions we ask at the beginning. And then the speed of how fast it's going to run, which often that doesn't really matter overall, but it does play into effect of depending how many times you're going to use it or how many people are going to be using the tool. That's something you do want to consider. A big, huge one, right, is the skill level of the person writing the automation. As brand new to automating, you don't want to be trying to do something very, very advanced, right? It makes it much more difficult. Another really big one, which is this is what's good, because I actually did the video on this a couple of years ago now, I think, of these 17 ways, but the context has changed. And a lot of the ways that we used to love, they're just getting older, and most newer programs don't have that infrastructure in order to automate them. So if, it's really great if you can automate something, but if that doesn't apply to the program you're using, it's kind of useless, right? So there's that approach. Another huge one is the number of examples and tutorials, and how do you learn how to take that approach, right? Which is one of the big things with UIA we'll get into. Before, UIA was cool, but there were no libraries really to use it. And now there's some really cool libraries with some good trainings we've done videos on, and I've seen other channels do them. And then the whole thing of V1 versus V2, which version of AutoHotkey are you going to be using, can really have a huge effect, of course, of which approach you're going to take.
Right. You see, on the point that you mentioned, reliability on one computer, which is like things that you're going to do for yourself. Another thing that is related to that is the fact if this is a one-time thing. So if I'm going to go ahead and automate something just to get out because I have to do 50 clicks or whatever, I just do it at one time. I don't care that it's reliable because I'm not going to use it a second time or a third time or whatever. But it goes into the category of, yeah, is it just for you? Yeah. Is it just one time that you're going to run it? Then yeah, that might be another thing to take into consideration.
Now, for the webinar, when we talk through the scores that we gave it, of course, because thankfully, because of Isaiah and Maestri and other people that I have working for me, they're experts, right? So, and theoretically, we should all aspire to be experts because you have more tools in your toolbox, right? You have more approaches and this and that. So the ratings we're going to give this are from us, but depending on your skill level, just so you need to take that into account of like, well, do I really want to learn how to do all these other things, right? But for us, we're going to assume, because this is what we do for a living, right? We do this on multiple computers, which more often than not, it happens a lot where you think it's just going to be yours, but then you end up sharing it with other people, or they do. And so we also take that context. Reliability over speed. This isn't speed like, hey, I want to have a 3,000 weight sleep. It's just how fast it's going to work. But we don't usually worry about that. We more worry about it's going to be consistently accurate. Yeah. So that's where we put our priorities. There's an expert doing, as I said, and then now we're doing everything in V2. However, sometimes there are some things that are just a V1 thing, right? So here are the different approaches. Let me see if I can get a good, there we go. That's decent.
Yeah.
And here, what I've done is Ace and I beforehand had talked through, and this is the cheating way to do it, is we're going to go through each one of these. These are some of the things to highlight, the differences in V1 versus V2 and what you want to keep your eye on and stuff when you're comparing the two. But I'll share a link to this document later, and I'm going to go add a few more links for some of these new libraries for V2. You know, sending mouse clicks and keystrokes, kind of like we do with Automate My Task and other stuff. We gave it a 4 or a 7, and it's kind of funny because 9 out of 10 times you almost never see. We don't talk about sending keystrokes, right? However, this came up with a client. Is he on here? I don't see him right now. Jeff. We were doing stuff, and he was trying to use UIA for automating something, but he was automating a browser, and it was quite complicated. Well, no, it wasn't a browser, was it?
It was a normal program, but the problem
was using UIA on it. And it was really tough to navigate around. And Isaiah was trying to explain to him, yeah, we don't always go with UIA depending on what you're doing, because with Connie in one of our tools, we were having problems with both UIA and even ACC. He's been having other problems with it, right? Those are external libraries that are, I mean, Descolada is a friend to the channel, right, and to us, and we can help him work on the library, but it's out of,
it's not native to Windows, right?
Yeah, right.
Now, here's the thing. So where would I go ahead and use sending keystrokes, specifically if I'm navigating? So there's some locations where you can use the up and down arrows, the tabs, the enter key. In one example, one of the people that we were working with, we couldn't navigate easily with up and down arrows. I think this is the problem that Connie is facing, that his program, you cannot navigate with the arrows and hit enter to enter into a window. So he has to click on them. In that case, we go with UIA because we can find the object and try to click on it. But in other situations like Joff, what happened was that we couldn't click easily. So then at that point, we switched in that situation just to sending a tab and then an enter and then an Alt-N to open whatever it was. It is easier. The thing is, it is reliable up to a certain point. The main issue with it is if while you're sending the keystrokes, you type, that's going to affect what you're doing. If the window that you're sending the keys to loses focus, that's another problem. So again, it's not 100% reliable. That's why we didn't give it more than a 7 out of 10. But it is reliable and it is easy to understand and easy to use, right? It's not, anybody could go ahead and learn that one really, really easily, right?
Yeah, the other thing I would say is to keep in mind when you're doing this, and this has come up time and time again, right? And I mentioned it a bit earlier too. When you start down a path with given any one of these tactics, the approach you're taking, usually like Isaiah will be working on something and he picks, let's say, using UIA, right? And he's going on the path and he gets stuck on something this morning. He doesn't necessarily come to me to advice on how to use UIA, but we'll talk through something. The thing is, his brain is down the path of UIA. And when someone else comes into the conversation, also they'll be like, well, why didn't you just send a keystroke? Or why didn't you take a different approach entirely? Right.
Which is for Connie right now. Yeah.
Right.
So you're having issues with that. Yeah. You're having issues with that little control. Hey, is there any other ways that you can toggle that control without UIA? You can use UIA for anything else, but can you hit enter and it works? Then just send enter, right? So,
yeah. Just recently, I was on a call with Maestrieth discussing something, and then I said, hey, we're having a problem with this other thing with our tool. And he's like, well, in SQL, you could do a recursive query. And I'm like, what? So he offered up something that I wasn't aware of in SQL that you could actually do in it. Just the point is, we all have different knowledge bases and our experiences and stuff. So it really helps having a community, having other people to talk to, whether you use the forum, whether you use the hero group or whatever, right? Have a place where you can talk to other people that have different backgrounds, because it really helps.
Now that with the scope, can you refresh on that?
Well,
so the scope from V1 to V2, we recently, I think yesterday, we talked about scope in functions. So were you referring to that type of scope in here?
In the example, when we were making the video for the V2 intro to V2, and we added a hotkey, and then it was just like sending we were trying to send keystroke or mouse clicks actually in the example, and it was just a reminder: scope in V2 is very, very different than V1.
Yes.
So just keep that in mind when you're working with them,
especially when you're sending clicks and those kind of things. Yeah,
getting a location and then sending a click there and stuff. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Right. Now, image search and pixel search, those are the ones that we try to avoid as much as we can. The reason for that is that they are really unreliable on other people's computers and even your own. Even in your own computer, an image, when you take the screenshot, might look a little bit differently than when you are using the program. So if you took a screenshot of a button with your mouse over it, it might have a different color than when you put the mouse away. So the pixel or image searches might not work as intended. So it's really unreliable. We use it as a very, very last resort. We actually had a client that we were doing an automation for an older program, and we couldn't click, we couldn't use the keyboard, we couldn't use UIA, we couldn't do almost anything. We had to use pixel search. It is working, but we know at some point he's going to say, oh, it didn't work in that other computer. Well, yeah, we know. That's one of the issues about it.
Yeah, it's honestly like a last resort. Now, unless, this is where, like with Automate My Task, I have something very quick and simple to do just on my computer. It's a one-off thing. I might use it for that, right? Like, especially with Automate My Task, because it makes it simple to get your image you want to search and then write a quick loop to program, to click it or something. Makes it very, very simple. So for a very quick, simple one, yeah.
One of the differences from V1 to V2 is that image search and pixel search, the first parameters, the X and Y locations, are just variable names that you put in there. In V2, you have to use an ampersand in front of those because those are variable references by ref. And those variable references, you already had it, right?
Yeah, sorry.
The variable references is a thing that is new in V2. And those kind of functions that set a variable, you have to put the variable references, as I have been talking about in other videos.
So send message and post message. Now, I don't know how many of you guys here have actually used those. Well, the irony is you probably all have. You just didn't realize it because AutoHotkey uses them in the background. They've wrapped it a lot of the stuff that we do stuff with controls and other things. You're actually using that, just don't realize you're using those. But they're crazy powerful. They're very fast. They're very accurate, highly reliable. Like they're amazing.
I would just phrase it in a different way. That's the way how controls work. Win32 controls, all of them work with sending and posting messages, 99% of them. So if you figure that one out, if you learn those, that's the best way that you can automate some controls on Windows. But the problem is it has a very steep learning curve because the things that you're sending are structures. Many times are structures and pointers to stuff. We're not used to those. So from our perspective, as an expert that knows how to do that, for me, it's a 9. For you, it might be a very low value 1 because you don't want to spend the time understanding all what goes behind it. But either way, this is the most reliable, fastest way of controlling many things. Now, the shell hooks are kind of, whenever you think about a hook, it's just a notification. Think about it as a notification. The shell, which is, for example, the Explorer window, when something happens, it sends a notification and you can capture that notification. For example, when a file changes, Explorer might notify you that the file changed. And you can connect to that notification, and whenever it happens, you can perform an action. There's a lot of interesting stuff that you can do with it. Again, this is one of others that have a very steep learning curve. You have to understand the messages, you have to know how to use them, and so on. They are really reliable. That's why we gave it a high score of 8 or something like that. Because if you're connecting to hooks, you're doing the best you can, basically in the sense of reacting to stuff.
I'm going to add to that and say, I'm going to slightly disagree with you, not because you're wrong on that they're complex, but there is a good function, I believe it's function library, for working with them. Jackie showed me in a podcast that we did. So we have a good video on it. It made it very simple to watch for a given window, like if something happens and they're lightning fast, like they're crazy fast.
That's for sure.
And you can actually correct me if I'm wrong, you can intercept the thing and basically take an action before like other things, react to it. So
yes.
it's really mind-boggling.
Yes.
But that function library was, I followed the video. I'm like, holy cow, I actually understand what you're saying. Like it's not rocket science. Made it very simple. Someone did a good job wrapping it in a function library to make it simpler, because you're right, it's an advanced topic, but there are ways someone's wrapped it where it's not crazy hard to do. And like you said, they're amazing. They're really fast.
I think for now, function is in V1, I think. And after you get the hang of it, so it's only V1, but after you get the hang of it, you could do it in any of the 2 languages because the difference is not that much. It's just the fact, if you have ever used the onMessage command, it's very similar. It's just you hook to a message, and whenever that happens, you call a function. That's it.
Okay. DLL calls. they're unfortunately, let's look at I know from talking to you, Isaias, the V1 to V2, like he changed a lot of the stuff, right?
The conversions, things don't have the same meaning. There's a few things that are easier, but there's some other parts that are really tricky. So the DLL calls are great for automating stuff that allows you to use Windows native functions, and the DLL calls kind of like open the door for you to use those native functions. But again, if you don't know what you're doing with the DLL calls, they can be a really, really tricky subject.
Well, and most of the examples you'll find in the forum, and by the way, we talked about it just the other day, but the forum, the V2 now is like the dominant thing. And there is a subthread for V1 questions, but now you're going to have to go find the V1 stuff. But those examples are all V1, and so there's not that many examples for V2. My question to you, though, Isaias, is did the changes he make, because I know a lot of the changes that they made to V2 were to make it more in line with other programming languages. So have you ever tried to use like a DLL call from another language? Is it closer to that? So let's say I could go to Stack Overflow maybe and see an example using a DLL call. Is it going to be closer to that?
No. The main differences between DLL calls have to do with the byref. So any variable that will be set has to use the ampersand, for example. Other changes is just that you can pass buffers, which is a concept that not many AutoHotkey users have. So that is really tricky. If you have ever used the var set capacity to kind of like set the size of a variable, you don't need to do that anymore. You have to use a buffer and stuff like that. So the change is more structural, more than making it in line with other languages.
Okay, thank you. Now the next one, and this is a tough one because Isaias and I different, of course, because his and my skill levels are different. Clipboard is amazingly overall simple. It's very handy. I think of it as like the ultimate global variable, right? Like I can use it. Actually, unless you're Descalada, who thought up of using was it the title bar?
Title bar of the, yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah, that was the fun, interesting thing. It's great. Now, we did see, and by the way, it's called A_clipboard, or actually, can you use both in V2? Is that right? Do I remember?
In V2 is a clipboard. In V1, you can use both at the same time.
They backboard it? Okay.
Right, but the clipboard one is gone, so you shouldn't use clipboard by itself. Now, if you're wondering, how can I automate with clipboard manipulation? Well, the point is, certain situations, I use it for communicating between two programs. So we were trying to automate something in Chrome, for example, and we had an extension in there that did the automation. But I wanted to do something with AutoHotkey that communicates with that extension. There is no way to connect the two because Chrome is secured in many ways. So for creating my automation, I usually resorted to clipboard, sending the information through the clipboard between the two programs to create the automation that I really needed. So that's the way how you would use clipboard. The problem is it is a global variable that any program can set. So if you're automating and you're depending on the clipboard, another program might change the clipboard unexpectedly, and your program might behave weirdly, so that's the gotcha on that one, which is the reason why I told Joe, hey, let's lower the score on that, because even if you're an expert and you know what you're doing, things can happen unexpectedly, and it's going to be really hard to troubleshoot a clipboard manipulation automation.
So now with controls, which again, they're amazing, right? Don't get me wrong. In V2, they've broken them down slightly differently, so they're a little bit better organized. I think it makes a little more sense.
That is right.
But
have a lot of little functions for them. Yeah.
Unfortunately, now here's the thing: this is one of the things. Like, it depends. If you're actually trying to automate an older program that has the Win32 controls, they're amazing, right?
Perfect.
The problem is, most programs nowadays, like what we're looking at right now in Windows, like this ribbon up here, doesn't have the standard Win32 controls. So we can't, I think some of the edit ones, like this one might be, if I still remember right, like there's a couple that are, but most of them aren't. And so it's more about the prevalence of tools that we're trying to automate, is getting the lower score. It's not that it's not a great approach. It's that fewer and fewer programs. Yeah.
It was the best, but
times people hire us to work on older programs, so it is still great. It's just more so, a lot of people are automating newer programs, and it's just not something you can use for most of them.
Right, but the next one actually is a little bit more in use, because even if the program has the newer controls, most of them have a system menu that is in line with Win32, and then you can use the menu select or WinMenu Select item, which is in V1, the name is really long, it's WinMenu Select item. In V2, he said, why do I have to type so much? Let's just make it menu select. So the name changed a little bit, but it allows you to kind of like in one line, select a sub item in a menu by just specifying the path that you want to reach. So it is really good. So if your program, like for example, this one here, Word, I don't think at the top it has a normal menu.
No.
But if you wanted to go to home, a line or whatever, if it was sub menus, you could do so in one line, and that was really good, and it was really stable. It was not something that. Yeah, so for example, here, right?
These menus and submenus. And correct me if I'm wrong, Isaias, my understanding of it isn't that you're sending this, it's not like sending Alt-F-N.
No.
There is a command that is tied to what this triggers. That is what you're actually.
Yeah, so each element has an ID, kind of like a pointer, an ID. And when you do the menu select, whatever it is, it gets the pointer to that thing and just call it directly. So it is something that it is not about, you will not see the menu open and navigate. It's not going to do that. It's actually going to call exactly the function that is in that submenu without even opening the menu, which is why it's really stable. It is really, the low score is because more and more programs are ditching the menu in favor of other controls. So Yeah.
But it's a really good one to have in your back pocket because sometimes it comes up and it's like, wow, it's available. Great, use it. And
let's use it.
and it's
That's right.
very simple to program in, by the way. Like you can either use the indexes or the names of the menus. So either one works, and it's really fast and accurate. So yeah, it's a great approach. I think everyone here we've seen us working with the ACC and UIA libraries. Actually, let me go ahead and reveal both because they're so related, right?
Right.
But generally speaking, so the ACC was the Windows Accessibility Library, which was really old. And then the UIA approach circumvented it. It replaced it. The ACC is deprecated. The UIA is the newer approach for it. However, again, depending on the program you're trying to control and automate,
you might have some issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Connie right now is working in something that we tried to use UIA with, but it had some issues. We definitely couldn't use the library, but we used ACC, and he has made a lot of progress on it by clicking many things. The only problem with them, so we do like them a lot. We actually think they're one of the better ways of approaching clicking on a GUI or getting values from a GUI very quickly.
You know what I would add to it, Isaiah, and we didn't mention it earlier because nothing else is like this. The really cool thing about UIA is you can learn one approach and it will automate almost any program, right? So even though it's much more complicated, it doesn't really matter the program you're connecting to. For the most it does matter, obviously, because we just mentioned that we had some problems with it, but it can control more programs than any other approach we're mentioning here, just because the prevalence, it's in every program, almost every program.
Now and I don't know if Connie is hearing, but here's the thing. You see this button right here? That is a find button. I'm marking it here on the top right. That is the find button. As you can tell, it's not simply a button, it's also a menu, which probably has some items inside, has some children. So probably if you're trying to access a child of that button, what is going to happen is that probably the child does not exist unless you click on the small arrow there. So if you can click, Joe, on the little arrow there to the find, you see these buttons here, they don't exist unless you click on the little thing. So that's what gets really tricky with UIA and ACC, that they're not really straightforward. Like even if you see the button, it didn't create everything. It's just to save memory at some point. So that makes it a little bit trickier, because then that means that your approach has to click somewhere first before giving access to other parts of the program.
So that brought up two things, Isaiah. So it's a really good point. One was during the free call just yesterday morning, we live stream on YouTube. Hopefully you guys watch that. And someone mentioned when they minimize the GUI, ACC no longer, UIA no longer works. We're like, yeah, that's because you basically destroy the Windows, and Windows is saving memory. And so that's why it's no longer there, right? The other one, I've forgotten.
While you remember, but the point is, automating with UIA is stable. That's the best it has. That is really stable. The only thing is that it's tricky, really tricky, and it needs a lot of experience with programming. So you have intuition about, oh, that button is not going to be there unless I click on it. You know?
I remember my second point. So, which we also didn't discuss. If you just categorize in general, we think of two approaches. There's an API, a programmatic way to do something. Then there's the I'm going to imitate a human, like the sending of the keystrokes and stuff. That's usually you're imitating a human, unless you're using control clicks, and then it's a little bit more like an API, right? Well, the UIA and ACC, this is where it's a little weird.
It's in between.
You're imitating a human, but programmatically imitating a human, if that makes any sense.
In between.
So, yeah, you can only do what's in the GUI. Right. So with real APIs, usually there's things that you can do whether there's a GUI or not. It doesn't matter. But with the UIA, programmatically interacting with the GUI, which does come at a little bit of speed loss compared to a regular API, that's still usually very fast, right, and highly reliable. But just to keep that in mind, which is what Isaiah's point was, that's why this menu doesn't, you have to click this first to bring this menu up. With an API approach, you wouldn't do that. You could do something.
You just call the function directly.
Which was like the menu select item there. That's really more of an API approach, because you're not triggering that menu to then go click the thing beneath it. you're programmatically hitting the target already without triggering the GUI, right? So that's the
right.
difference there. And there's nothing wrong with ACC compared to UIA. It's just that it's deprecated and it's been deprecated for a long time. But the two libraries that Desclavo has created, they're amazing. And they're still, he said they're out of alpha, right?
Right, yeah.
But that's the thing. It's like you're relying on someone else working on something. And we pointed out an issue with one of the libraries, and Desclavo looked at it and said, yeah, actually, for this example, he actually contacted Microsoft saying, hey, what's going on with this thing? Anytime you're relying on another library, it's just, hey, if there's something internal that AutoHotkey has directly instead of someone else's, implementation of it, you're kind of better off, if you can, use an internal API approach over using an external library.
Right. And just to remind you of the other point, it's not always only using one approach. You're using UIA, whatever.
Absolutely.
But it can happen in that this specific instance, it's better to send a keystroke or send a click, a normal click, which Connie had kind of like a loop and it was trying to double click on the item by doing a loop. Sometimes it's just better to get the position of the item and send click to. And that is it. It just clicks twice. That's it. So at that point, the methods, all of this is not focus on one and use only that. Is, hey, know that there are different approaches. And depending on the situation, pick one over the other. Most of the times you will pick UIA for the whole program, right? But there are certain situations in which that's not really the way to go. Just go and use something else that might be easier or might be, working as you need. That's it.
Yeah, actually I'd add to that, the ACC, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is the UIA, they often give you the coordinates, the XY coordinates of what it is you're inspecting. And so if you can't programmatically trigger it, hey, I can reliably, without using OCR or some pixel image search,
or image search, yeah,
get that location and go send my manual click, right? Which is going to be,
it is kind of like, you see how you can get the name or the value. You can also get what is called the bounding rectangle, and the bounding rectangle is kind of like a square of the location where that control is at. So yeah.
All right. Moving on, the file. Now, this actually, part of it has to do with what Isaias mentioned earlier about using the clipboard as a way to interact with programs. The file reading and FileObject is kind of a similar thing. If like sometimes you need to save data from other things and then go read it and this and that. I just want to mention here, and it's not a biggie, but I believe it's the file
open and file read
object.
Right, the file read and the file object. You can use.
You used to have to use the code page, right?
Like 65001.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very, well, to those of us that are non-programmers, it was very like, what? Very geeky. Now you can put like UTF-8 and it'll set it that way. So
that's just for file read. For file read and file write, you can do that.
Okay.
Now, here's the interesting thing. As file read, write fall in the same category as the clipboard, most of the times, I would prefer the file read, write to the clipboard if the other program can read and read files, right? So because that way I know that it is my file and no other program will touch that file because they don't know about it. So unless you have anything very specific that you have to do in the clipboard, like for example, setting the clipboard to HTML, right? So that you can paste HTML. Unless you really need that, then I think usually if you need to share information between two programs, just use a file read in lieu of clipboard sharing.
By the way, I'm going to throw in a bonus one that we did an 18th approach. And it's kind of funny. Let me give you a quick background. I'll keep it short. Several years ago, I had this list prepared and I asked Isaias, we had a call several years before that where I just got to meet him. And then I asked him, because I knew he was an expert. I said, hey, he wasn't working for me, right? I said, hey, I have these different approaches. I'm just curious. Can you look at this list? Tell me if I'm missing anything, right? At the time, I had the standard in out listed. And then from that call, he started working for me like within the next day. I think you went back and said, I'd like to give my 2 weeks notice. They're like, you know what? It's okay. You can leave. And so the next day he started working for me. It was kind of wild because that wasn't the plan. Anyway, in generating this document, we had that standard out and we kept talking through it and going, I can't think of an example of how I would use that to automate a program. And so we removed it. However, just the other day, a couple times it's come up where we're like, like I'm automating FFmpeg, and that's one.
I need to get the information from FFmpeg, for example. Yeah. You can read. I think you can file read the input, the standard output, and so.
And the
Very
example with Maestriath in Studio, he was running his scripts by using that
standard input on like the object, the shell object.
right,
Yeah,
the
that is right.
execute AutoHotkey scripts without even creating a file. It was
Right.
so. There's the bonus one. But there's not a lot of training on it, but maybe someday we'll get around to making some. But it is a complex topic. Yeah, it's pretty cool that you can do that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, APIs, application programming interface, right? That is almost, I'll say, the cream de la creme, right? Like it is the go-to if the program has an API, which a lot of them do, and we don't realize it because we have AutoHotkey, right? But oftentimes, what were we talking about the other day? Is we were helping someone, and I said, "Oh, there's a commandlets syntax.
Right.
Is it a PDF thing?"
No, and we used ChatGPT to try to get that.
Right.
Right, I remember.
It was with Shodi with the Power BI, right?
Oh, right. So
it had some sort of its own API approach, and we're like, hey, maybe we can, automate.
I would definitely think a command line interface is a type of API. It's a programming approach for that program that you can call it from the command line with specific parameters, and it just does whatever you asked it to do. So there's a lot of programs, like, for example, most Microsoft programs have command line interfaces that you can send. For example, you want to open a Word document, but convert it into something else. You can open Word document, and then you put some parameters to change it. So when we are referring to programming specific APIs, I guess those also fall into that particular category.
Yeah, and actually on that same call with Shodi, we were talking about Vote. What was the name of his tool for the speech to where you can talk and it hears you and reacts to what you say? We were looking at the tool, and itself takes the executable and then the word spoken as a parameter, right? And then and you automate off of it. So it was doing that as well. So obviously, AutoHotkey, it is amazingly easy to manipulate the registry. Now, words of caution, if you're not a programmer, you can kill your computer if you mess with the registry, right? So it's not something
very funny stuff with it that then you will be wondering, why the heck did I do that?
You can't boot, and so back up your registry. But it's super simple to find the paths and to update or to read it, also to set things, and it's really just a text file. So you just have to understand how it's structured and where to go, the right keys. That's another one, ChatGPT, for another tool that we're creating here. Makes it really easy. It's pretty amazing. All right, so the status bar in this one, again, it would have gotten higher scores. It's just not as prevalent anymore compared to what it used to be. And it's one of my first uses of AutoHotkey. I was using business objects, and I could never tell when my query finished running. It didn't give me any real notification. I'd have it in the background, but it didn't make a noise, didn't flash, didn't do anything. So I figured out how to read the status bar, and in the status bar, it would say done, but there was no notification. So I just monitored that, and then I would put up a big flash and make it ding. It was really easy, but it's a great way to be able to track a program if it has one.
Now, the status bar, you can set values to it, or you can get values to it. But I think mostly in automation for other programs, I think we would use it mostly to gather information about the program really quickly, which, which I think it falls on the controls. You see the controls line that we were talking about. For example, that you can get the whole information out of a list view of any program. So if it has a list view, you can get the whole thing. It would be the same with the status bar. It falls into the same category of, hey, you can use the status bar control or the list views to gather information about the program that you're automating without having to screen read or OCR or something like that.
Well, it was one of my first real ahas that AutoHotkey is not just a stupid little library. Was with SPSS, I just have this handy, so I'm still going to pull it. You can see, you could easily detect what is selected. You can detect all of the items in the list programmatically, get that. You could even hide stuff and do stuff with controls and make them disabled or move them around and things like that. Was all crazy powerful. And Zace's point is just, hey, with the status bar, whatever, you're programmatically getting that, ripping it out, doing what you want with it. It's not something that's quirky and slow. As long as it's available, it's quite powerful.
You want to know what the user selected? Hey, just grab the information out of the list or the job.
So case in point, back to the thing when I was using business objects, I could select as many as I wanted to from a given list. Like I can't select more than one, but I could select as many as I wanted to. The problem was business objects only allowed you to do a query on 99 items. And I'd be selecting and selecting and selecting. I'd get past it, but it never told me I was past it. I didn't know how far past it I was. So I built a script. So while I'm selecting and I would get to the 99, it would tell me, hey, stop selecting. You're maxed out, right? And it saved me so much time, but it's just a silly thing. But it was like, wow, that really was phenomenal for me.
Right.
Okay, COM objects. Who wants to guess what we rate this? Because
that's a good one.
The reason why it's not a 10 is, they're a little advanced. And each COM object is quite possibly a little different, especially if you look at the Outlook object. Whew, it's very expansive. Like it's just, wow, it's big.
A lot of time to invest.
Crazy powerful.
Yeah. The way how I do it is that I just research what I want at that moment. So I don't learn the whole thing. I just go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to use the COM object. Okay, so I need to open thing. How do I open thing with the COM object? And I look for that. Oh, and now how do I select this? But then how do I select and I get that? Because I cannot read the whole object and get the whole information because it's too much. So I just learn it by parts. That's the only reason why we scored it just a tad lower, because for many people, it doesn't make sense to spend that much time on learning that, if the only thing that you want to do is select and make something bold. Well, if that's what you want, just send Control B, because it's going to bold your selected text. So the trade-off between how useful it is for simple stuff and how good it is too big. I actually think I love it for big projects, for complicated projects, but not for simple stuff.
Yeah, and that's where I told Isaias too, we put together our objects course, and he kept talking about classes, objects and classes, and it was really on classes, and he kept bringing up COM objects, and I didn't really get the connection. And finally, when you have a class, all the methods and everything, that's what you have in your COM object, right? But I was telling Isaias, I've been using COM objects for years. I never understood classes at all, but in a COM object, it was just clearer to me, easier, and the syntax is easier to follow. But you can do crazy stuff with COM objects without being a very advanced programmer. You have to understand classes, because that's basically handled for you. You have to understand getting a handle to it and connect to it. But once you can look up them now, Isaias goes and looks in the MSDN to understand and see what's available. I usually just go to Stack Overflow and say, how do I do this? Or ChatGPT, and it gives you an example, right? He's reading all the advanced stuff, which is good, don't get me wrong, but you can do amazing stuff with them. Like the slightly cool stuff. One really cool example is he's done this in a tool where he is programmatically connecting to JavaScript and calling JavaScript within AutoHotkey. Like he's actually calling the JavaScript methods from within AutoHotkey. It's quite powerful.
Right.
We also gave it a 9 because, and someone reached out to us, they were asking us to do it with Python, because you can connect to programmatic just like with the JavaScript. And we actually had some problems. There was some weirdness going on and we couldn't figure out how to.
Again, it's not like straightforward as just sending keystrokes.
Yeah. Speaking of not being straightforward. So
when APIs.
Yeah, API calls are amazing. I, especially as being a data scientist, when I first learned about them, I was just dumbfounded, because I'm like, I can programmatically connect to servers and do queries and pull my data. They're phenomenal, especially compared to web scraping. They're much more reliable and consistent. Having said that, and honestly, if it wasn't for the OAuth, someday we'll get our OAuth figured out, the OAuth 2, where the handshake, and have it standardized where everyone uses, like, at least have more than one use the same approach, right? It just seems like everyone makes up their own approach and you have to study it. And that takes me, let's say if I'm going to do a project and it's going to take me 20 hours, 15 of it will be figuring out the OAuth. The actual using of it is so simple. It's just the stupid OAuth, and that's the authentication and stuff. If they have OAuth 1 available, it's usually really easy, but that's not as likely anymore. It's still prevalent, but not as prevalent it used to be. So you're basically connecting the servers online and doing a query and returning usually almost always JSON, every once in a while XML or other structures as well, even CSVs you can. But they're amazing because if you're paying for given tools from a company, they can have APIs. Oh, like even we did an example today with the translation, Google Translate or Google Maps or the YouTube API for extracting your subtitle. I mean, there's so many things you can do with them. They're phenomenal and they're really fast and very reliable and often free, not always, but usually free.
Yeah.
All right. The last one is just because it's an interesting thing is sometimes you need to know information about your computer. And
Yeah.
this WMI task, it's amazing what data is available. I mean, is you talked to it. I know you were talking earlier.
So this one is, I wish I knew more about it because I know the basics. The basics is that the Windows keeps kind of like a record, a huge record of information about the computer. Almost anything you want to know, think about it as the registry. The registry keeps track of the state or settings of programs. The Win management instrumentation keeps track of the computer itself. Almost anything you want to know about it is there. Now, it is tricky not only because of the amount of information that is there, it's just how to get the information varies in certain situations. You get structures, you get certain weird things that we are not used to. But I do think, again, I rate it lower just for the amount of time that it takes for you to learn, the learning curve. But when you're automating stuff, whenever you're automating, you very likely need information about many things on your computer, especially the data that tells you about the current status of the computer. And you could get that. Oh, I need to automate printing. I don't know which printer is connected to my computer. The Windows management instrumentation will tell you that right away. How many monitors I have, because I want to display or I want to move a window from a program from my main display to a different one. Well, Windows management instrumentation tells you how many monitors, where they are, what are their sizes, many other things that you can just query it, give you values, and then you just do whatever you want. So it is really useful in automating desktop applications. The only thing is that it's really a lot of information. It's a lot of things. So
yeah, there's a good example out there, and I have it as a download. If you search the Automator, there's I'd say like 20 different scripts, and each one of them gets different pieces. Now, there's to Zeiss's point, there's a lot more than what I have in the download, right? You can go investigate it. But the ones I remember, I think years and years ago, I asked a question in the forum about getting unique information about a given computer, and through the WMI, if I remember right, I was able to get the serial number from the motherboard.
Exactly, yes.
And it's just the crazy stuff you can pull of all installed fonts or like just anything and everything you wanted to know about the computer, like it's available.
That's right. I'm wondering if now I could get the current DPI scaling on this font metrics from it to fix my programs. Because I could just grab that and let's say what it is, right? But yeah.
Hopefully that isn't too overwhelming. Now let's go ahead and open it up to more questions if anyone has on a specific thing of what you're trying to do, and do we wow you too much? Was that too much information?
I think a lot of those things you guys knew about, right? So there's a lot of little details that you guys knew about, but there are some of them that I'm not really sure. By the way, so which ones haven't you ever heard about?
I do think I overlooked the menu select item command in version 1. And I think I have something that might help with. So I'm going to go, or several things. So I may well investigate that once I get an opportunity to go back to projects.
There's a good library out there. There's a couple playing with it, but Lexicos has one. And I told Isaiah, we need to update it because it's so amazing. It actually looks at the program for you and tells you all the options. And he has it where you double click it and it goes and triggers it. So you can see very quickly if it'll work. Mm-hmm. But I told Isaiah, he should have it where you right click it and say, write the syntax that will give me this.
The V1, right, exactly.
Yeah, just make it that much easier.
And don't feel bad, Noel, because when Joe mentioned that to me, I had been coding for 14 years. And then he mentioned like, wait, here, there's this WinMenu Select. And I was like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, what? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
so,
well, as I said before, you learn something new if you pay attention and avail yourself of, the opportunity.
Amen.
Anybody else has any comments or questions?
Yeah, or we want to discuss using a certain one that you've tried, and you guys are really quiet today.
What course should we use for COM objects?
We do have one for COM objects on the Automator. So we have a course that was objects and classes, was it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the classes, the intro to classes, or intro to objects.
Right.
Yeah, and classes. The caveat I want to say though is it doesn't teach you like Excel or Word or Outlook. It's teaching you classes.
How to create your own COM objects. Right.
Basically, right.
Okay.
And I have a ton of stuff on Excel and some on Outlook and a little bit on Word and a little bit on PowerPoint of videos. The point is that it's very different. Like if you're going to use, by the way, I'd say probably my guess is like 60% of Microsoft programs have a COM object available, at least the ones that most people use. And it's phenomenal when it's available. Even and if you go to COM, the-automator/COM, you'll see a list of programs that I've outlined, the more common programs that people use that have COM objects. So like even WinSCP is a program not by Microsoft, but they have a COM object. SPSS has a COM object. So a lot of programs have COM objects available to them. But as we were saying earlier, each one's different. What I would do is just Google the forum first, and then Stack Overflow would be the second one, or ChatGPT, which could probably give you the code nowadays to write it.
Okay, thank you. One other question, is there a need to write or to produce new courses for V2 that you already have covered in V1? Is there plans for that, or should I just jump in with the V1 courses?
Well, we're working on an intro to AutoHotkey in V2. There's our, V1 to V2. If you're already a V1 user, yeah, we have one that helps you jump into V2. As you can imagine, it's going to take time to recreate our courses for V2. These things take, a month or more to produce. It's not like it's a simple thing. That's a month of full-time work, right, for Isaias. So it's not something we can just crank out. We're a small shop and we do client work and other stuff. So
yeah, but
it's going to take time.
We are doing it. So we are working with V2 in mind. So soon we're going to have a few things, but yeah, it's still a work in progress, basically.
Completely understand. Answers my question. I'll go start with the V1 course.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you 100% new to AutoHotkey or?
No, I've been using AutoHotkey for a long time, but I'm not anywhere near you guys. I've got elements in my scripts that I copied and pasted off the web. I understand how they work, but I couldn't free type them.
Fix it. Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing. And then there's things that I haven't understood that I copy and paste, like like COM or even the classes and all that kind of stuff that I need to take the courses on. So I was wondering, if it was around the corner, I'd wait for the V2 version, but if it's not around the corner, then I want to jump in on the V1 version and then just know that I have syntactical things not to observe necessarily in the V1. I've already got the V1 to V2 course.
Okay.
So, that's very helpful. And the converter, which is very helpful. So, but I need the conceptual thing of the older courses.
The good thing is the objects, the intro, or do we call it intermediate objects? Excuse me, I think it was intermediate, because it's a mid-level type thing, right? But it's still, objects and classes are an advanced topic. So that's why it's hard to summarize it clearly. But in that course, Isaias actually talked about maps. And did you talk about fat arrow? I don't remember. I don't think.
No, I did not talk about fat arrow.
But that one,
it didn't come up. It was not needed for what we were doing. Yeah.
Now, I would say do not buy the GUIs course, because GUIs have changed so drastically compared to everything else. GUIs are by far the biggest change, right? With the V1 to V2, in that you look at them and they're so different. I would be like, just wait for a V2 GUIs course, because I would feel criminal if you bought that course and then you learn it and then you look to go to V2 and you're like, oh my God, they're all really classes and objects, right? Like it's right. So much, to me, cleaner and simpler. You honestly could take the objects course and then you could know GUIs far better than if you took our intro to GUIs course, is the way I would look at it.
Technically, that's right.
Yep.
Well, appreciate the guidance.
Yep. Yeah, and I would love, if I could clone Isaias, I would. we're trying to balance creating new courses and, still doing these live calls and doing client work and everything else. So yeah, it's tough.
No worries.
We were both very surprised that the V2 was officially launched in,
The amount of time it did,
Yeah.
yeah, that was really fast. That's right.
I know you talk about the guy that doesn't sleep, but I got you guys in that class too.
So
Awesome.
thank you guys for being here. I think that was an awesome call, and whatever we need, if you had any questions, just let us know in the hero group, and we'll be more than happy to assist you.
Yeah. So again, as a reminder for those of you that aren't heroes and watching this later, we have a private Telegram group that they can chime in at any time and ask questions, and either we try to answer them or other hero members chime in and help answer people. So it's really a fun collaborative group helping each other. And so, yeah, we just have lots of fun, and consider joining. Hope you enjoyed this. Chime in on questions if you have them. I'll have this as available as a download, but let me get a little more update stuff into it, but it'll be available soon.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks. Thanks.